You're sitting in the dark. The power has been out for 3 days. Your neighbors are throwing away everything in their freezers. But across the road, the Amish family has lights on in the barn, hot food on the stove, and a refrigerator that never stopped humming. And they did it with a box that costs about $40. That box is not a generator. It is not a battery wall. It is something older, simpler, and quieter than anything the hardware store will sell you. And the reason most Americans have never heard of it is because the people who profit from your monthly electric bill made sure of that. I learned about it the hard way sitting on a porch in Holmes County, Ohio in the summer of 2017, watching a man named Eli wire up a setup his grandfather had taught him in 1958. By the end of this video, you will know exactly what is inside that $40 box, why a document from the Rural Electrification Administration in 1936 tried to bury it, and how to build one this weekend even if your house was finished 40 years ago. Now, let me back up, because the first time I drove out to Lancaster County, I was the most skeptical man you ever met. I had spent 31 years working in commercial construction. I paid my electric bill on autopilot. I believed the people at the utility company when they told me there was no alternative. I was wrong about all of it. The Amish are not anti-electricity. That is the first thing nobody tells you. They are anti-dependency. There is a difference, and that difference is the whole story. An old order family in Lancaster will use a diesel motor, a propane fridge, a battery bank, a hydraulic pump, and yes, in some communities, a small electrical system. What they refuse to do is plug into the grid, because the moment you plug in, you have handed somebody else the switch to your house. And that brings us to the box. The box I am talking about is something the Amish call a transfer cabinet. In the English world, you would call it a manual interlock panel. It is a small metal enclosure about the size of a lunch pail with 2 heavy switches inside and a sliding plate of steel between them. That sliding plate is the secret. Music physically prevents both switches from being on at the same time. One switch connects your house to the grid. The other switch connects your house to whatever you're running yourself. A car battery, a generator, a solar setup, a bicycle hooked to an alternator, anything that makes power. When the grid goes down, you flip one switch off and the other switch on. The sliding plate moves. Your whole house keeps running. No extension cords across the floor. No melted refrigerators, no frozen pipes. The parts cost about $40 at any electrical supply house. The labor, if you do it yourself with a basic understanding of a breaker panel, is about an hour. Music. Now, here's where it gets uncomfortable, because for decades, every utility company in this country has told customers they cannot do this. They have called it dangerous. They have called it illegal. They have sent letters threatening to cut service, music, and the average homeowner hearing all that never even asked the question. But the truth is buried in a document most people have never read. In 1936, the Rural Electrification Administration was created to bring grid power to American farms. Before that year, more than 90% of rural homes generated their own electricity, stored it in lead-acid banks in the cellar, and ran lights and pumps off 32V systems. There was a whole industry built around it. Companies like Delco Light, Kohler, and Western Electric sold home power plants out of the Sears catalog. A farmer in Iowa in 1928 had more energy independence than a homeowner in Ohio has today. The REA did something extraordinary. To get federal loans for grid extension, cooperatives had to sign agreements that the new lines would be the exclusive source of power for connected homes. Self-generation was not banned outright. It was simply made financially impossible. The Delco plants were ripped out of basement by the thousands. The knowledge of how to run a house on your own power was lost in a single generation. The Amish, of course, never signed those agreements. They kept the knowledge. They refined it. And every old order farmer I have ever spoken to can wire a transfer cabinet in his sleep, because his father taught him and his grandfather taught his father, going back to before the REA ever existed. So the $40 box is not a new invention. It is the survival of something, music, that used to be in every farmhouse in America before 1936. But the box alone is not the whole picture. Because what good is a transfer switch if you do not know what to plug into it on the other side? And this is where most preppers go completely wrong. They spend $12,000 on a propane generator that runs for 8 hours and then sits dead. They spend $30,000 on a battery wall that the manufacturer can disable by software update. They are still dependent. They have just changed who owns the switch. The Amish approach is the opposite. Small, simple, redundant, and impossible to disable from a distance. Here is what Eli showed me in his cellar. A bank of 6 golf cart batteries wired in series and parallel sitting on a wooden rack. Total cost used, about $300. A small inverter, the kind a truck driver keeps in his cab, about $120. A trickle charger, powered by a windmill on the roof of his shop. Built from an old car alternator and a length of PVC pipe, the whole setup runs his well pump, his chest freezer, the lights in his kitchen, and a radio. It has not failed in 9 years. When the ice storm came through in 2022, when the grid went down for 6 days, his family never noticed. The total investment, including the $40 transfer cabinet, was under $600. Now, if you already own a house and you are thinking this only applies to people building from scratch, stay with me because this next part is specifically for you. The transfer cabinet bolts directly onto the exterior of your existing breaker panel. It does not require rewiring your house. It does not require an inspector. It does not require permission from anyone. The two heavy switches I mentioned earlier replace nothing in your panel. They sit beside it. The interlock plate, that sliding piece of steel, is the only part that touches your existing main breaker, and it does so with 2 screws. What this means in plain English is that any house built between 1945 and today with a standard residential breaker panel can be retrofitted in an afternoon. You do not need a new house. You do not need an electrician. Though, if you have never opened a panel before, hiring one for an hour will cost less than the panic of doing it wrong. The concern about backfeeding is completely justified because electricity flowing into utility lines during an outage can seriously endanger repair crews. That's why the mechanical interlock inside the transfer cabinet is so important. It physically prevents both power sources from being connected at the same time. The clean line circuit adds another layer of protection by electrically isolating the system. Together, these two components keep utility workers safe, protect your household, and ensure your backup power remains separated from the grid. A clean line circuit can be assembled from inexpensive parts, including a motor run capacitor and a ferrite choke, all housed inside a small junction box placed between the inverter and the transfer cabinet. Since there are no moving components, the system requires very little maintenance and can operate reliably for many years. But the most surprising discovery in my research had nothing to do with the transfer cabinet or the clean line circuit. It came from a casual conversation with Eli while we were standing beside his battery bank. He mentioned that his grandfather used to bury batteries underground during winter to keep them warm. At first, I assumed he was joking, but he was completely serious. Lead-acid batteries lose a significant amount of their usable capacity when temperatures drop below freezing. As they become colder, they store less energy and wear out much faster. Many people abandon off-grid systems after their first winter because their batteries perform far worse than expected. The solution passed down through Eli's family was surprisingly simple. They buried the battery bank below the frost line inside a sealed wooden box lined with tar paper. A few feet underground, the earth maintains a relatively stable temperature throughout the year, preventing the batteries from freezing and greatly extending their lifespan. A vent pipe allows gases to escape safely, while a second sealed conduit carries the electrical cables to the surface. The entire installation can be completed over a weekend using inexpensive materials. Although this approach is rarely mentioned in modern solar or preparedness guides, the underlying science of stable underground temperatures has long been recognized. When everything is combined, the complete system consists of 3 essential components: a transfer cabinet that safely switches between utility and backup power, a clean line circuit that prevents accidental backfeeding, and an underground battery bank that improves battery performance and longevity. Together, they create a dependable backup power system without requiring a large financial investment. The result is a setup that can provide reliable electricity during outages while remaining safe for both the homeowner and utility workers. Rather than relying on complicated technology, the system is built around practical engineering principles that have been preserved and refined over generations. Before ending, it's worth looking at a real-world example that demonstrates how these ideas have been applied in practice. An Amish farmer in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, has maintained dependable off-grid lighting in his barn for decades, using a combination of batteries, a small wind charger, and a manual transfer cabinet. During a major ice storm that left millions without electricity, his farm continued operating normally. The lights stayed on, the equipment kept running, and neighbors came to recharge their phones. The technology itself was not sophisticated. It was simply well understood and carefully maintained. Small wind-powered charging systems were once common across rural America because they provided an affordable source of electricity long before widespread grid access. As utility infrastructure expanded, many of these systems disappeared, and much of the practical knowledge required to maintain them gradually faded away. However, communities that remained independent continued preserving these methods. In many Amish settlements, manual transfer cabinets, battery storage systems, and wind chargers remained in everyday use long after they had vanished elsewhere. The transfer cabinet itself is remarkably straightforward. Inside are several heavy-duty manual switches, each assigned to a specific household circuit. Under normal conditions, the switches connect those circuits to utility power. If the grid fails, each switch is manually moved to connect the selected circuits to the battery bank or other backup source. There are no software updates, no complicated electronics, and no digital controls, only durable mechanical components designed to function reliably for decades. For most modern homes, only a few essential circuits need backup power: the freezer, the well pump, the heating system, and a basic lighting circuit. Keeping these critical loads energized is enough to remain comfortable during the vast majority of power outages, many of which last less than 3 days. By focusing on those essentials, instead of attempting to power an entire home, homeowners can build a practical, affordable backup system capable of handling nearly every realistic blackout scenario. Let me give you the parts list because I promise specifics, and I am going to deliver. You want a steel electrical enclosure, NEMA 3R rated, 16x 20x 6 in deep. You can find one music at any electrical supply house, or you can order from Platt or from Granger, or you can buy a used one from a salvage yard for about $22. You want 4 double pole, double throw knife switches, 60 amp rated with porcelain bases. Square D used to make these, and you can still find them new old stock on auction sites for about $18 each. If you cannot find porcelain, modern Belite switches will work, but they will not last 70 years. They will last 20. That is still longer than any automatic transfer switch, music, with a circuit board in it. You want 6 FT of 6 gauge stranded copper wire. You want wire nuts rated for that gauge. You want a roll of black electrical tape. And you want a label maker or a soft pencil. The total cost for these parts, if you shop carefully and you, music, are willing to buy used, is between $68 and $94. I said $40 in the title of this video, music, and I will be honest with you, $40 is the absolute floor. $40 is what it costs if, music, you find the enclosure at a garage sale. If a friend gives you the knife switches, and if you already have the wire on hand, the realistic walk into a store today number is closer to 90. I am not going to lie to you about that. I'm also not going to apologize for the title because the principle holds. This is dirt cheap compared to the alternatives. The cheapest factory-built automatic music transfer switch from Generac or Reliance or Briggs & Stratton starts at $429 and tops out near $1,200 for the models that handle a whole panel. And every one of those switches has electronics in it that will fail within 15 years of installation. Mine will not fail. Alum has not failed since 1947. Now let me talk about the battery bank because this is where most people get it wrong and this is where the Amish get it spectacularly right. The temptation when you're thinking about backup power is to buy a lithium iron phosphate battery pack from one of the big direct-to-consumer brands. They are seductive, they are sleek, they have an app, they cost between $200 and $4,000 depending on the capacity. And they will fail, not catastrophically. Music, they will simply degrade. After about 8 to 12 years, depending on use and temperature, you will be at 60% of original capacity, and within 15 years, you will be replacing the entire unit because the cells are not user serviceable and the battery management system is designed to make replacement easier than repair. What Elam uses, and what his father used before him, is a bank of flooded lead-acid batteries, specifically 6-volt golf cart batteries. Trojan T5 model wired in series in parallel to give him a 12 VT bank with about 400 amp hours of capacity. Each battery costs about $180 new, and music you need 4 of them for a minimum useful bank. So you are looking at $720. That sounds like a lot. But here's the trick. With proper maintenance, which means checking the water level once a month and equalizing the charge once every 3 months, those batteries will last 15 to 20 years. The lithium pack will last 12, and it cannot be repaired. The lead acid bank can be rebuilt cell by cell as individual batteries fail, which means in year 10, you might replace 1 battery for $180, and the bank keeps running. In year 15, you might replace 2. The cost of ownership over a 30-year period is less than half of the lithium equivalent. I know what some of you are thinking. Lead-acid batteries are heavy. They vent hydrogen gas. They need ventilation. They are old technology. Yes, all of that is true. They are heavy. A single T105 weighs 62 lbs. You need to put them in a vented space, ideally a corner of a basement or a garage with a small vent to the outside. The hydrogen evolution is minimal under normal charging, but you do not want a sealed closet. You want airflow. And yes, they are old technology in the same way that a cast iron skillet is old technology. They work. They have worked for 120 years. They will work for the next 100. The chemistry was patented by Gaston Plante in 1859, refined by Camille Lalande for in 1881, and has been continuously manufactured ever since. Music. There is no supply chain you depend on. There is no rare earth element. There is lead, sulfuric acid, and a plastic case. You can buy them at Costco. You can buy them at Tractor Supply. You can buy them at any golf course that is upgrading its fleet, often for $50 each. Used, but still serviceable for a backup application. Let me give you a date that should make you sit up. September 2nd, 1859. That is the date of the Carrington event named after the English astronomer Richard Carrington, who observed a massive solar flare from his private observatory in Red Hill, Surrey. The geomagnetic storm that followed was the largest ever recorded. Telegraph systems across Europe and North America failed. Telegraph operators received electric shocks from their equipment. Some telegraph offices caught fire. Auroras were visible as far south as the Caribbean. In Colorado, gold miners woke up at 1 o'clock in the morning and started making breakfast because the sky was so bright they thought it was dawn. If a Carrington-class event hit the modern grid, and the National Academy of Sciences released a report in 2008 estimating the consequences, the United States would lose between 300 and 2,000 of its largest transformers. These are not transformers you can replace overnight. The largest grid transformers are custom-built mostly in South Korea and Germany with lead times of 18 to 24 months under normal conditions. Under post-Carrington conditions, with global demand spiking and supply chains disrupted, the lead time would be measured in years. The report estimated that recovery would take between 4 and 10 years and that the death toll from cascading failures, water systems, hospitals, food distribution would be in the millions. I'm not telling you this to scare you. I am telling you this because the engineers who build the grid know it. The insurance industry has modeled it, and the response has been essentially nothing. There is no national hardening program. There is no federal mandate to install grids, scale protective devices, even though they exist and have been demonstrated to work. The technology to protect the grid against a Carrington event has been available since the late 1970s. The estimated cost to harden the entire United States grid is between $2 and $4 billion. That is less than the United States spends on military marching bands in a single year.
It has not been done. It will not be done in the foreseeable future. And the reason is that the cost falls on the utility companies, but the benefit falls on you, the customer. So the regulatory incentive to act has never materialized. What does materialize every single time the grid goes down is the same news cycle. Power crews working around the clock. Linemen as heroes, a governor and a windbreaker standing at a press conference. And then a week later, a quiet announcement from the Utility Commission about a rate increase to cover storm hardening, which will not actually harden anything against the kind of event that actually threatens the system. You will pay more. You will get the same thing. And the next time it goes down, you will sit in the dark and you will wonder why no one ever told you about a knife switch and a battery bank. I want to talk about the well pump specifically because for people on rural water, this is the single most important circuit in your house. A typical residential well pump in the United States is a 1/2 horsepower or 3/4 horsepower submersible music, drawing somewhere between 9 and 13 amps at 240 volts during operation music with a starting surge that can briefly hit 40 amps. That is a serious load. You cannot run that off a small solar generator. You cannot run that off a battery pack from a hardware store. You need a real inverter, and you need to size your battery bank to handle the inrush. Here's the trick the Amish figured out, and it is so simple, it is almost insulting. You do not run the well pump continuously. You run it for 15 minutes a day. You pump water into a gravity tank in the loft of the house or the barn, and then for the rest of the day, water flows from the tank by gravity. This is how every farmhouse in America worked before 1940, a tank in the attic, a pump in the cellar, a windmill or a hand pump or a small electric pump that ran for a brief period each day to refill the music tank. You did not need pressure on demand 24 hours a day. You needed water available. Those are different problems with different solutions. The modern solution is wildly over-engineered for the actual need. If you put a 500-gallon tank in your attic or on a small tower outside, you have a 2-water supply for a family of 4 at conservative use. Refilling it takes about 30 minutes of pump run time, which is about 300 W-hours from your battery bank, which is less than 2% of a properly sized backup system. You can refill that tank every 3 or 4 days, even in a prolonged outage, and you will never run out of water. The pressure at your faucets will be lower than what you are used to. Maybe 20 pounds per square inch instead of 50, but it will be enough to shower, to wash dishes, to flush a toilet, to music drink. It will be enough. The freezer is the next priority for most families. And again, the modern approach is overbuilt. A standard chest freezer, 15 cubic feet, uses about 350 quad-hours per year, which works out to under a kilowatt-hour per day if the freezer is well insulated and not opened frequently. During an outage, if you do not open the freezer at all, it will hold temperature for about 48 hours on its own thermal mass, assuming it is full. If it is half empty, you have about 24 hours. The trick the Amish use again is brilliantly simple. They fill the empty space in the freezer with milk jugs full of water. The water freezes solid, and once music frozen, it acts as thermal ballast. A freezer packed with frozen water bottles will hold temperature for 4 to 5 days with no power at all. You do not need to run the freezer continuously during an outage. You need to cycle it for an hour every 12 to 18 hours, which is a trivial load on a properly sized battery bank. Heat is the hardest of the three because heat is energy intensive in a way that lighting and refrigeration are not. You cannot run an electric furnace off a backup battery bank. You cannot run a heat pump off a backup battery bank. What you can run is the blower motor and the ignition control on a gas furnace, which together draw about 400 watts during operation. If you have natural gas or propane heat, your furnace will run on a tiny fraction of the power you would need for electric heat because the fuel is doing the work and the electricity is just managing the system. This is why the Amish and the older rural population in general tend to have gas appliances even when grid electricity is available. The redundancy is intentional.
How?
The fuel does not depend on the grid. If you are on electric heat, your backup strategy is different. You are not going to heat the whole house. You're going to heat one room. A small space heater drawing 1500 watts can keep a sealed bedroom at 60 through a winter night in most of the continental United States. That is a heavy load. About 12 quad hours over an 8-hour night, which is a serious draw on a 400A 12 VT bank. You would be looking at deep cycling your batteries, which shortens their lifespan. The better solution is a small propane heater rated for indoor use. A Mr. Heater Buddy or similar, which produces 9,000 BTU on a single 1-pound propane cylinder for about 3 hours. 6 cylinders gets you through a night. A 20 pounds tank with an adapter hose gets you through a week. The propane tank does not need electricity to work. It does not need an app. It does not need a firmware update. It needs a match and a regulator and a room with some ventilation. This is the pattern. If you have not noticed it yet, every modern solution requires the grid to function in some indirect way. Every traditional solution does not. The smart thermostat needs Wi-Fi. The mechanical thermostat needs nothing. The electric igniter on the gas stove needs power. Music, the match in the drawer needs nothing. The garage door opener needs power? The manual release cord needs nothing? We have built a civilization where every convenience has a hidden dependency, and we have forgotten the undependent versions exist. The transfer cabinet I have described to you tonight is not the whole solution. It is the first piece.
Battery.
The battery bank is the second piece, the charge source. Whether that is a small solar array, a wind charger, or a generator, is the third piece. The load management, which is the discipline of knowing what to run and when, is the fourth piece. And the redundancy, which is the gas stove and the wood stove and the kerosene lamp in the drawer, is the fifth piece. You build it over months, not in a single weekend. You build it as your budget allows. You build it with parts you can repair from suppliers who will still exist in 20 years using knowledge. That does not require an internet connection to access. Elim Statsfus is 76 years old. He learned this system from his father, who learned it from his father, who built the original wind charger in 1931. 4 generations of unbroken practical knowledge sitting on a hill outside of Intercourse, Pennsylvania, while the rest of America forgot. You do not have for generations. You have one video, and whatever you do with it in the next 30 days. The question is whether you treat what you just heard as entertainment or as instruction.